I'm Rob Walker. I should be chairing this session. It's my very, very great pleasure to be chairing a session in honor of Mike Shapiro, who I've known for many
decades. Your mic is off all of a sudden, Rob.
Let me try that.
Okay, yeah, you're back now.
Can you hear me? Mike has produced a steady stream of articles and books for many decades, beginning or almost beginning with Language and Political Understanding way back in 1981, Politics of Representation in 1988, and a series of texts which were greatly influential in developing the critical theory of IR field. The co-edited book on international intertextual relations, violent cartographies, reading the postmodern polity in the late 80s, early 90s. And then a series of books on cinematic politics, geopolitics and cinema, methods and nations, politics of time, and the list keeps growing. Mike has an extraordinary range of analyses out there. He's also quite extraordinary in the depth of his theoretical understanding, which he wears very, very lightly. Sometimes I think too lightly. He's been a great supporter of IPS since its inception. He's been a great supporter of the Winter School. He's been a great teacher, a great disruptor of mediocrity, a natural transgressor of disciplinary boundaries, and a huge repository of fantastic jokes. So it's my great pleasure to introduce him here today, and also to introduce Sam Opondo and Roberto Yamato, who will be responding to a few brief remarks that Mike will begin with on his recent work and on his work more generally. So over to Mike. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rob. I was going to talk about my writing politics, studies in compositional method, but I'm now on to a new project and I'm kind of bored talking about it. So I'll pass on that and talk about instead my current work on the politics, on the aesthetics of equality. Part of it that was inspired by a remark that Foucault made, and I can't even find it any longer. But he said the invention of photography allowed the ordinary person to rise above the threshold of recognition. And so a lot of what I've been focusing on in this new project is the way in which a variety of artistic texts create a presence for people who are otherwise invisible. And the chapter I'm currently into, which I'm going to read some of, is called Latinx Urban Presence, Architecture as Public History. And I begin with a section on swimming pools, inspired in part because every time I fly into Los Angeles, where I have children and grandchildren, you see all these blue bobs from the plane window. So let me begin here. My inquiry into the architectural articulation of Latinx presence in public history begins with a look at one of Los Angeles County's most visible architectural features, swimming pools. Flying into Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, affords one a view of acres of swimming pools that reflect what Laura Bliss, a journalist, calls chlorinated class politics. Quote, peering out from an airplane window, it's hard to miss the swimming pools. Hundreds of thousands of sparkling blue bobs patch the county's landscape, though not evenly. In Southern California, where space and water are getting rarer by the day, pool ownership rates as a decent proxy for neighborhood wealth, end quote. I then ask the question, what does it account for these blue bobs? And I go back historically and say that while currently they register income disparity, historically they're part of an ethnic segregation story, which begins in the mid-20th century Municipal swimming pools were desegregated in the 1950s, and by the 70s and 80s, tens of millions of mostly white middle-class Americans swam in their backyards or suburban pools, while mostly African and Latino Americans swam in inner-city municipal pools. The class profile of private swimming pools is well captured in John Cheever's 1964 East Coast situated story. This is a great story he wrote in 64 called The Swimmer. His protagonist, Nettie Merrill, sat at his own pool, one hand in the pool and one on a glass of gin. And he saw with a cartographer's eye a string of swimming pools, a quasi-subterranean stream that curved across the county. He made a discovery, a contribution to modern geography. And he would name the stream Lucinda after his wife. And then on an impulse, he decides he's going to take a swim along the Lucinda stream, which requires making his way along the path of pools in his segregated bourgeois enclave. His encounter when he reaches the Bunkers pool, where a poolside cocktail party is going on, is exemplary. Quote, prosperous men and women gathered by the sapphire-colored waters while caterers, men in white coats, passed them cold gin. Given the permission that his whiteness affords, along with being known socially by all the pool-owning neighbors, the only impediments to his journey are drink invitations that slow down his progress. Okay, end of story. The Los Angeles version of the ethnic segregation story is in part zoning related, a result of redlining and other restrictive practices to keep out Black people and immigrants. As single-family zoning became the norm by 2010, LA's shrunken zoning envelope resulted in a metropolitan region that has the fewest homes per capita of any metro area in the country. As one investigator calls it, as a housing crisis, Los Angeles County fell 1 million homes behind relative to its population growth after becoming a single-family mecca, thanks to federal freeway subsidies, subsidized home mortgages, some ingenious modern architecture, and the mythology of the pool, the garden, and the individual. In essence, a vision of paradise that ended up being primarily for white people. The pervasive presence of swimming pools attracted two very differently motivated artists. This is the center of my analysis here. One is the English artist David Hockney, who executed a series of splash paintings featuring shimmering water and the bodies of male bathers. A gay man arriving in LA from the gray, often sunless cityscape of London in 1963, he was inspired by the pool's brightness, colors, and the male bodies using them. The substantial corpus of pool images he indicated has done more than any other artist to create a visual signature for California and LA area. Attracted by Hockney's pool paintings, another gay man, the Latino artist Ramiro Gomez, imitated and re-inflected them. He too composed pools and bodies, most notably a versioning on Hockney's splash paintings. However, rather than the objects of desire, the bodies in the pools for him are class codes. They're bodies at work rather than at leisure. The Latino pool cleaners that Gomez adds to his pool compositions constitutes a form of politically oriented productive reception. Having viewed the luxurious homes with their private pools from the perspective of his former work as a nanny, he decided to riff on David Hockney's iconic work, A Bigger Splash, shifting the focus from the splash to the worker. In focus for both Hockney and Gomez is what California offers to the eye. Attracted by architecture and bodies, Hockney was especially struck by the brightness, colors, and the horizontal style of upscale LA homes. In addition, the initial excitement of the California backyard swimming pools for Hockney was as a setting for the private views of naked or semi-naked male bodies. And I have in the middle of this essay his painting called Peter, Getting Out of the Pool Without Any Clothes On. In contrast, Gomez has been concerned with the bodies that have been invisible, striving to bring to the foreground the Latino laborers who make possible the comfortable lives of the more affluent Angelenos, often illegal people who perforce strive not to be seen. His riffs on Hockney's pool paintings substitute the leisure bodies working bodies for leisure bodies. For example, in place of the splash, Hockney's painting a bigger splash, he substituted a pool cleaner and a housekeeper and entitled it No Splash. I'm going to just finish in a moment. Gomez's politics of aesthetics, his image-articulated interpretations of a Latinx presence in white domestic space, reflects a major aspect of the Latino urban condition. In LA, as in other parts of California, much of the post-Guadalupe Hidalgo story witnesses the Chicano community integrated and subordinated into a colonial labor system, while Hockney's highly selective vision of Los Angeles was trained on the city's distracting visual presentness, which obscures its ethno-history. Gomez's politically inflected Hockney homages restore what LA's visual sublime erases, a pastness. He recovers an ethno-history sedimented into a contemporary domestic labor force. The essay goes on, and what I do is I go back into the history of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the presidios that were used by the Mexican Californios basically to suborn a different labor force, Native Americans who were a virtual servant class. And now, with the re-Latinization of LA, what has happened is that there's an underclass of Latinos that is constantly being displaced. For example, when Chavez Ravine, the Dodger Stadium, was created, a Latino neighborhood was cleared out. And the freeway system that was developed in the 60s bisects the Latino American neighborhoods. And so it's a constant battle, basically, to create a domestic lifestyle for the Latino Americans. And I have a lot more to say about it. I'm going to do an analysis of a novel by Helena Viramontes, who creates a solitary walker, a woman named Turtle, a temporal trope to go back to the past, who walks along the neighborhood, and contrast it with the film Falling Down, where the man known as a defense, his name is Defense, he used to be a defense worker, is suddenly cast off the highway and he walks around the neighborhood, a white man basically learning what the ethno-history of California is about. And I'll stop there for the time being and allow people to respond. Okay, who's up? Is it Sam's order, not her? Oh. Your mic's off again, Rob, can't hear you.
You have to unmute, yes.
Okay.
Sam has to unmute too.
Okay, I can hear you now. Sam's lips are moving, I can't hear it, yeah.
Give me a minute.
Okay.
Okay.
It again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. It wasn't allowing me to unmute. So I'll read my response. And as you all see, it's difficult to keep up with Mike. The readings were on writing politics, and he's now onto a different project, a project that in some ways is in resonance and resonates with some of the work that we are doing together on the aesthetics of precarity. But I'll just read a little bit of my reflection that touches on this work and other work. Thank you, Joao, for inviting me to be part of this roundtable discussion in honor of Mike Shapiro, a generous teacher, friend, and collaborator. It's also nice to talk in honor of a friend and to do so with other teacher friends like Rob Walker, who introduced me to Mike when I was Rob's student, and Beto, who Mike introduced me to many years ago. To be invited to speak in honor of Mike is in itself an invitation to reflect on the politics of genre, value, ethics, aesthetics, and the composition of words, and texts. To do so among friends who value friendship and who value friendship but also friendship with concepts and an ethico-political reorientation of the world makes this a most pleasurable experience. With Mike, one is also invited to think critically about what authorizes a given genre, of which he notes even philosophy comes in a variety of genres, whether it's the essay, the meditation, the treatise, the manifesto, the epistle, or a mixture of these. Thus, one has to think about the different kinds of subjects created by different genres and the politicizing effect of fracturing and mixing genres, or the writing as critical thinking derived from Shapiro's juxtaposition of texts, thought worlds, genres, and events, as you've just seen him illustrate in his Aesthetics of Equality project. Given that this is an international political sociology session, it is worth noting Mike's transdisciplinary and even undisciplined engagement with worlds, affects, styles of writing, and styles of living, which question the very boundaries or ways in which the discipline poses its problems, who or what it excludes as it constitutes itself, and the modes of thought that it authorizes. With multiple books, again, very difficult to keep up with his writing. There's always a new project unfolding. It is also evidence of something else, a transdisciplinary and indisciplined thinker who is also a very dedicated and disciplined writer who finds pleasure in the composition and attending to his craft. For instance, his recent work, Writing Politics, offers, and I quote, a series of investigations that are philosophically informed and literature attuned, end quote. While his investigation of politics and time, that's another book, treats a series of reality-shattering events that register time as a lived experience for particular historically situated subjects through narratives that marginalize the official story in order to have us understand that time does not unfold through a collective narrative. By taking time and paying attention to these bodies, micro-practices, and rhythms, Mike calls our attention to how some of our movements and gestures are choreographed, and the choreography being most effective when we no longer pay attention to it, when it becomes a kind of muscle memory or habit of thought and effect. These choreographies regulate movement of bodies, whether it's the rhythms of work or migration, but also work through the punctuation of speech, text, space, and time, the ordering of bodies and the embodiment of orders, the temporality-grammar relationship, and the rhythms that they put in place are what makes it possible or impossible for us, and this is Mike quoting Fanon, summoning at the end of Wretched of the Earth, to look elsewhere than Europe or capital in order to work out new concepts or try to set afoot a new human. There's also an act of reading. And in addition to the literary montage that invites readers to extend their imagination through a critical reading of scripting practices in his Politics of Writing book, Mike also supplies a way of reading politics and text that unsettles habitual reading practices. Let me illustrate this by speaking about my first encounter with Mike's work, which came through a reading of his Reading Adam Smith book. While I was initially struck by the chapter on Manning the Frontiers of Humanity, where Mike's treatment of Ridley Scott's film Blade Runner and the Philip K. Dick novel that it is based upon enacts a politics of aesthetics that illustrates how this text, and I quote, places heavy pressure on the long-held assumptions that moral sentiments are uniquely human and that they provide an unambiguous boundary between humans and other creatures, end of quote. I have often returned to the subtle, yet not very subtle gesture in the opening section of the book. Here, Mike highlights the multiple modes, positions, and dispositions that one can assume when reading a single text and how the dynamics of reception of a text inflect our perception. From the opening lines of the Reading Adam Smith book, Mike explicitly states that the book is not about Adam Smith in the usual sense of the word about, for it is neither a comprehensive explication of his views nor a careful tracing of the sources of them. Instead, it is an enactment of what must be turned down by those who want an effective, politicized understanding of modernity, In short, an understanding of the Adam Smith effect. To speak about Mike Shapiro then, and more so in his honor, is to speak of an encounter, not so much an hagiography of the person, but of the encounters that he enables. An encounter that provokes us to think, to explore the micropolitical openings, becomings, and engagements that invite us to read and write about otherness otherwise. It is an encounter that makes us more attuned to sublime reality shattering events, everyday rhythms, and unlikely juxtapositions and combinations that disturb and destabilize established orders. This mode of critique and its related compositional practices specifies an attitude rather than a particular destination. It is a mode of political thought that does not foreclose the question of the political, but instead encourages critical, aesthetic, and ethical political thinking, whether you're thinking about his cinematic political thoughts, of his aesthetics of equality project and other projects. It is a mode of engagement that deforms cliches and conventions, therefore enabling encounters rather than mere recognition, and thought rather than mere information. This, in my view, is one of the dispositions required in an information age where critical theories and incredulity towards meta-narratives and conspiracy theories, conspiracy theory-induced certitude both question established orders, but with different dispositions and positions on a variety of issues. Next, I'd like to speak about a note on method, which we've read many method books by Mike, whether it's Methods and Nation or his Transdisciplinary Methods book. Yeah, in Mike's book, the questions of method is always an issue that jumps up. In order to gain a politically perspicacious view on what is at stake in the above deformations, I want to conclude with a few remarks on philopoiesis as method, a journey that I have been fortunate enough to take with Mike, first as his student many years ago, and then as his co-author in more recent years. These notes on method and the indisciplinarity obtained from my very fragmented readings and the kind of interference that Mike's work embodies enacts how it enabled me to find my own writing signature, and with it, a different way of approaching the relationship between genres of expression, genres of thought, and genres of mind. In terms of method, I have found Mike's Shapiro's invocation of philopoiesis politically and diplomatically significant, as it is a move that names a certain discontinuous and refractive interference between philosophy and literature, such that literature questions philosophy and philosophy questions literature, and together they put the world into question. Philopoiesis, as Cesare Caserino puts it, loves potentialities, and it is in itself a love of poiesis, that is, a making of worlds and words. With philopoiesis inspired illustrations from cinema, architecture, literature, and the arts in general, Shapiro points out that what questions tend to essentialize issues and thereby elude the political negotiations we need to engage in for our creative dissensus. For instance, in one of our exchanges on life's contested dispositives, Mike refashioned the ontological question of life, what is a life, by stating, and I'm quoting Mike here, the critically enabling question is not what is life, but rather from whose perspectives and at what moment, in what kinds of places do questions about life arise? Who is enabled by the events in which life is put on the agenda, whether it's capital punishment, cloning, war atrocities, health administration, among other things. We have to be able to think about these events. Heeding Michel Foucault's epistemological analytic, Mike notes that the question to pose is not what is proper human life, but rather how is life constituted at various historical moments by the various agencies and practices that determine the proper versus improper life. And further, in order to elaborate on the politics of life, one question, the other question is what kinds of discourses and agencies achieve dominance, and what discursive genres and practices of life contestation emerge in these moments. Well, with the pandemic, these are questions that we cannot avoid. Here, Mike's thought on life's contested dispositives becomes what Deleuze says a kind of philosophy that is worthy of the event. As with most of his work, Mike questions the emerging consensus about humanity that works through genres of expression and discourses that moralize the figure of the human and the practical dispositions used to secure humanity, more so vulnerable human life, by subjecting it to power. His attentiveness to more empathic ways of becoming and agonistic relations, and his thinking on the ethics of encounter disturbs or presents alternatives to life managing and other managing moral discourses and aesthetic practices that have become part of the dominant apparatus that produces a certain idea of man and its implications for the politics of life itself. In terms of the analysis of life, Shapiro is interested in the ways in which it has been historically constructed and the ways in which human life becomes what it is against other than what it is. This line of critique is useful and enables us to tolerate the contingency and uncertainty about how life can be understood. It enables us to raise the question of how a model of life is administered, that is, how life emerges as a problematic in the spaces between ontologies and apparatuses of implementation. Such a reading of life opens up a space to raise the kinds of questions that Judith Butler raises when she's talking about injurable and grievable lives, or what Aimé Césaire and Achille Mbembe do when they illustrate how the idea, in reading of Hegel, has legitimated violence against colonized people and other precarious lives today. In our readings of Edward Said in other contexts, Mike Shapiro notes that the power to narrate or to block other narratives from forming and emerging is one of the primary mechanisms of the imperialist violence involved in the monological cultural encounters. Therefore, a major dimension of the politics of the aesthetics or the ethics of encounter, and in this case, the philopoetic interference, involves providing a counter-coherence that tells a story other than the dominant one, a mode that is attentive to those voices that had been thought of as mere noise, or those bodies that are jumped over, as we've seen him speak about reading of swimming pools in LA. Through philopoiesis, Mike Shapiro makes unlikely juxtapositions and creates literary montages that enact and amplify the ethical injunction to always question the limits of our conception of community. A community of the question, of the possibility of the question. A community that is open to an unforeseeable future. His commitment to aesthetics as method and attention to the compositional structure of texts and worlds means that his work over the years continues to refuse to follow the path provided by representative images and representational orthodoxies. It is a form of thought, writing, and living that actively works to liberate things for creative thinking while generously joining or inviting others to join in his essential chorus. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Thanks a lot, Sam. As I keep discovering, astute commentators understand what I've been up to better than I have.
Pastor Berto.
Okay, thank you, Rob. First of all, I want to thank João for inviting me, and Sam and Mike and Rob. It's an honor to speak in this roundtable, most especially being a roundtable in honor of Mike. I also wrote something in two parts, but maybe I'll just stick with the first one. It's an engagement with traces of Mike. I'll just stay with the first part. The second part, which is traces of Mike in Rio, I'll leave for maybe later. So just a sec. Can you guys hear me well, Rob?
Yeah.
Okay. I first met Mike in person in 2007 in my first semester at the PhD in International Relations here at IRI, PUC-Rio. I said in person because I had met Mike before through the traces he left in his books I read in a master's degree abroad, and in close friends of mine that could attend an eventful seminar organized by João and Izar in 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, in which Mike participated. 2005 entitled Theory in the Periphery, In 2007, then, I could finally meet Mike in person. And together with close friends who now teach international relations in different parts of Brazil, Daniel Aragão in Salvador, Bahia, Carlos Gama in Palmas, Tocantins, Marcelo Valença here in Rio, Fabiano Melnicucci in Porto Alegre, Rio Grande do Sul. I attended his postgraduate course on cinema and international politics, having the opportunity to engage with some of the material that would later become part of his book, Cinematic Geopolitics, published in 2009. For me, it was an event, a highly significant experience, one that has profoundly marked both my professional and personal lives and trajectories. Besides reading wonderful texts from Benjamin, Rancière, and many of Mike's published and then unpublished works, we watched and thought with wonderful movies such as Dirty Pretty Things, one of my favorites, and most importantly, we had the opportunity of being with, listening to, learning from, and having our thoughts critically provoked by Mike. During this course, as I think on some of its traces here and now, two or three things particularly marked me. One was Mike's commentaries on the difference between knowing and understanding on the one hand, and thinking on the other. I confess I did not fully understand exactly what he meant, but maybe precisely because of these critical limits, I was so powerfully affected by Mike, because Mike showed us through his readings and thinking with those literature and movies. In retrospect, I now relate it with a certain post-hermeneutic position that Mike adopts in his studies in transdisciplinary method, published in 2013. Drawing from Jacques Rancière's new Kantian approach to aesthetics, from Benjamin's concept of montage as critique, among others, there's something about that difference and Mike's post-hermeneutic position that later I start relating with the ethical political problem of judgment, the foundation of judgment involved in the calculation of the incalculable, to refer to Derrida's terms in Force of Law, and also, of course, with the kind of indisciplinary thought that Mike creates, performs, enacts. Relatedly, a second thing that marked me profoundly was precisely his indisciplinary response to my then disciplinary impulse to identify him as a postmodern theorist of international relations. If I recall it right, besides his refusal and resistance to being disciplined by yet another disciplinary discourse of the discipline of IR, he deconstructed my assumptions in many different ways. On the one hand, for instance, he problematized my assumptions about IR and the world, suggesting a Heideggerian move that would significantly impact me, taking the world not as a noun, but as a verb. And indeed, Mike worlds. On the other hand, Mike was the responsible for my encounters with post-colonial and decolonial studies. He was the first to introduce me to the works of Siba Grovogui and Walter Mignolo, for example. Moreover, in encountering with his violent cartographies published in 1997, I was displaced toward this other space of transdisciplinary studies, which articulated, as João has recently put, a creative, innovative moment of what we now call the spatial turn, a post-structural critique of modern representations, and a critique of ethnocentrism, among many other things. So a third thing that marked me profoundly was this ethical political position and sensibility in Mike's work and engagements, which introduced me to this other multi-dimensional space of critical thought, which articulated a rigorous post-hermeneutical new Kantian critique, a politics of aesthetics, a post-structural conception of language and critique of representation, and a post-colonial counter-archive and critique of ethnocentrism, just to refer to some of the traces that marked me the most. In this context, thinking it retrospectively, there was and continues to be something in Mike's thought and ethical political position that speaks to and translates an important problem to me, a Brazilian anthropologist, José Jorge de Carvalho, has synthesized as that of the encounter of the ethnographic gaze and the subaltern voice. In Glissant's and Derrida's terms, this would also involve a certain politics and poetics of encounters and relations. Mike's work and critical thought mobilize a post-structural critical thought drawing from figures such as Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, Rancière, among others, with a post-colonial sensibility and critique of ethnocentrism, which was extremely influential for someone like me aiming to engage with post-structuralism and post-colonial studies. But there was something more. Mike's work also engaged with cinema and literature, with arts, displacing his critical thought and ours within the humanities, cultural studies, popular culture. This broader turn towards the humanities was also something that greatly impacted me. In many ways, Mike is an artist, a movie director, editor, a poet, or to refer to a category that some just refer to, Mike is a philo-poetic, a philo-poet. Of course, as a student of IR, I had and still have no doubt that Mike is a giant in the discipline. Mike is one of critical IR's red belt grandmasters, if I may use a jiu-jitsu reference here. He was, continues to be, and will always be a central figure for the development of IR critical theory, broadly speaking, and post-structuralism in IR more specifically. His language and political understanding, international intertextual relations, challenging boundaries, violent cartographies, moral spaces, methods and nations, just to mention a few of his books and edit volumes, mark the discipline of IR, and most especially its so-called critical theory, profoundly. A central figure in the so-called language turn, as Nick Van Williams and Tom Lundberg have recognized in their rereading of the so-called new materialism turn in IR, Mike was also a pioneer and a central figure in what we may now call or recognize as the spatial turn, in critical border studies, in culture and popular culture studies, in city studies, and of course in critical methods and the aesthetic turn, just to again mention only a few enormous contributions of Mike to the discipline and most especially to critical IR theory. However, Mike's is an indisciplinary critical thought and have marked and impact other disciplines and other inter and transdisciplinary circles and circuits of critical thought as well. For instance, in 2012 and 2013, while studying in London in a law school very much inspired by critical thought, I was extremely happy but not really surprised to find out that many of my colleagues in critical legal studies attending the Legal Critical Conference, the London Conference in Critical Thought, or the Conference on Law, Culture, and the Humanities, many of them knew and were inspired by Mike's work. For instance, by his conception of literary justice. But Mike is not only a world-renowned critical thinker, he's also a nomadic critical thinker. As he recently told me, his is a nomadic thought. In my own reading, I thought that worlds, while traveling, encountering, and enabling openings for other different alternative worlds. In so doing, Mike not only is aware of the epistemic and ontological differences and politics involved, but also enacts the kind of ethical political relations and sensibilities he has once taught and engaged with in his moral spaces, co-edited with Campbell in 1999. And I'm saying this because very fortunately for us, Mike has been traveling to Rio de Janeiro repeatedly in the last 15 years. If I would have some more time, I would, even if very briefly, share with you some of his traces in Rio. And this will be the second part of this homage to Mike. But maybe I'll leave for later. And I guess I'll just say one or more two things. Since, and even before the beginning, Mike has been a central figure to the IPS Winter School. Mike had not only a wonderful film launched in his honor in the very first edition of the school, but also has been a guest faculty in all the editions of the IPS Winter School. In 2015, he taught us about the aesthetic turn and beyond, 2016 about thinking the event, 2017 about contingent flows, precarious lives, 2018 post-colonial precarities, in 2019 about aesthetic methods and the politics of media. And this year, of course, in 2021, being the sole reason for the organization of this roundtable, which was conceived in his honor. Indeed, I would say and share, and later I can talk more about this in more detail. I can only say that Mike has immensely contributed to the development of critical theory and critical thought here at IDI in our community. Mike, I would never be able to translate into words how much you have affected, impacted, inspired, and provoked us to think. Your contribution to critical thought, to critical IR theory, to critical theory and thought here at IDI, and to our IPS Winter School is simply incalculable. Besides recognizing this and very quickly sharing these constitutive traces, I can only say thank you, thank you. And we'll be waiting for you here, hopefully next year in 2022. Thank you very much, Mike. Big bravo and viva to you and to your life. Thank you so much, Mike, with all my love.
Thank you very much, Beto. One of the things I've been feeling wistful about is that I'm retired now from classroom teaching in Hawaii, and it's in the process of preparing classes, interacting with my students, that most of my ideas for all my writing has come up. Writing Politics began, for example, in a seminar by that title. And so I'm wondering, what is it besides the strong dose of caffeine I take every morning is going to inspire me to think? Let me say one other thing that I've been prepared to talk about. As both Sam and Beto have pointed out, I spend a lot of time paying attention to literature. There's one literary critic who really helps me quite a lot. His name is James Wood. And he has a new book out called Serious Noticing. And what he derives in that book is the way in which literature thinks, particularly writers like Chekhov, for example. And one of my favorites I wanted to say something about is Roddy Doyle. Most of his philosophical thinking takes place when he does an analysis of pub conversations. And in his latest novel called Love, I'm going to read you something I wrote about it in the intro to Writing Politics. On the surface, the plot of his Love is a re-encounter after a long hiatus between two 50-ish acquaintances, Joe and Davy, who go on a pub crawl together throughout the city of Dublin. As they reminisce and exchange sentiments and make judgments about their own and each other's life choices, primarily romantic choices, hence the novel's title, it becomes evident that words as well as characters are the plot's protagonists. Early in the conversation, Davy, who's both a character and a narrator, has asked Joe about his new romantic relationship and says, as the narrator, "I watched his face as he pushed back words that wouldn't do." Joe's struggle for adequate words proceeds despite his having, he said, packed words with my clothes and toothbrush when I was coming to Dublin for a few days. After Joe reveals that he may have fathered a child he's never met, Davy says, does she, Joe's paramour, say you're the father? Not in so many words, says Joe, who then adds his perplexity about what to say. It's tricky, Davy. Look, just tricky. I'm not doing it justice. The words are letting me down. While together they struggle to apply words to their romantic relationships, they wonder at several moments, 9 times in fact throughout the novel, in their conversation, if the word salacious is a proper one to describe some of them. For example, one of them says, I looked up the word salacious a while ago, Joe says. I Googled it. I've been hearing the word all my life and I knew what it meant. And I didn't exactly, if you know what I mean. And so what I want to say, this is not in the chapter, look what Doyle does with an imaginative invention of 2 middle-aged guys on a pub crawl. There, as in much of his work, he turns interactions in a mundane venue into deep reflection about life, memory, responsibility, reciprocity, and the gap between ontology and our means of expression. In my view, a famed analytic philosopher's musing, Davidson, pales in comparison, both thinking-wise and entertainment-wise. A brief anecdote. I was visiting Hubert Dreyfus, the Heidegger writer, at Berkeley one year, and that was the day that Donald Davidson, the analytic philosopher, was going to give his inaugural lecture. So Bert Dreyfus said, let's go and listen to it. So I sat there. He was a very smart man. He said interesting things. And I began looking at the students taking notes in front of me. And one young woman had started taking notes. And then halfway through, the pad said, things to buy, coat hangers, et cetera, et cetera. She got totally turned off before it was all over. Smart but boring. Roddy Doyle is never boring. Almost all his novels center on pub conversations. At one point, for example, 2 women are talking and one of them says, that guy over there doesn't look so bad. And the other one says, I'd rather shag the elephant man. Terrific stuff. Okay, I'll turn it back over to the moderator. You're not on here, Rob. Okay, Rob.
Be on as moderator. I'll open the floor. If you wish to ask a question, make a commentary, please put your hand up.
During this hiatus, I want to say hello to Adriana. She was in my course. Good to see you again. Hi.
I think Julia wants to talk, Rob.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Mike. This is really nice to meet you.
Likewise.
First of all, I'd like to say it's an immense pleasure to be able to talk to you. And for that, I would like to thank IPS Winter School for the opportunity. I am an undergraduate student. I'm working on my final project now, and some of your works have been of great help for me, especially studies in transdisciplinary methods, since I'm working on war photography as an object of analysis. And I have a thought that I would like you to comment on, if you'd like, which is about media and the creation of war images that somehow construct perceptions of war and its role on identity building. In cinematic geopolitics, you quote Alan Feldman notes on how the media portrays contemporary US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, in which he says, media eludes everyday sensory perception and becomes socially available as a cinematic structure, to which you also add the sensory of danger that may be later seen in the movies as well. And when I read that, I was thinking about how media coverage usually chooses a path to document explicit violence and create an image of the other an image of the other as a dangerous or as a naive figure. And I would like to know from you if you relate Vietnam War media coverage, which has influenced many American war movies until today, with how contemporary images of war on terror are being produced today as well. And if you think that Vietnam War media coverage still plays a role as a reference for the aesthetics of war today. And in resume, I guess I would like to know if that parallel is possible in both experiences in terms of image making, if it is possible at all. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Let me give a general response. Some years ago, I read a terrific article by Dorothy Smith. She's a sociologist. The essay was entitled "On Sociological Method," on a method from Marx. And one of the things, she does a commentary on trying to understand the news. And she kept trying to pay attention to the news by paying attention to the way in which news people themselves describe things. She asked the question, for example, what is spot news? And she found that if she kept getting examples of it, a fire, a death, a storm, and so forth, she couldn't understand spot news. What she finally realized was that the news takes place within an apparatus, what Foucault calls a dispositif. And so what constitutes the news, whether it's images or words, has to do with temporality, how much time one has to prepare for a broadcast, but also the competitive structure within which the choices are made. So what spot news is about is a function of the political economy of time, competition, and so forth. And so he asked the question, why that image rather than another image? One of the answers is, how much time does one have to produce it? What is the competitive context within which the photographer is working? In the film Salvador, for example, one of the war photographers wants to get the image. The most famous war image is the one by Robert Capra during the Spanish Civil War, when you see a man who's just been shot. He wants something like that because what he wants to do is win a Pulitzer Prize. And so the motivational structure, the career dynamics of photographers becomes a very important part of how it is that we have such a thing as war. And so what are all the forces at work that make it possible to take a picture? What are the motivational structures? What enables people to do it, and so forth and so on. And what Dorothy Smith figures out is she constantly asked the wrong question when she paid attention to the way in which the discourse of news works. So what spot news is not a storm, it's not an example, it's something about the structure within which the news is about to be delivered. The other thing that occurs to me is that the famous essay by Andre Bazin called the Political Ontology of Photography it's the ontology of the photographic image, in which he asks the question, what is the difference between a photograph and film, which adds duration? And one of the things that bothered me about that is that there are many ways in which particular single images are durational, right? As long as we can figure out the context within which they takes place. In one of my books, The Political Sublime, I spent a lot of time talking about a still painting by Albrecht Dürer of his father. As I was walking through a gallery in London, I took a look at this portrait of his father, and I saw what looked like an angry man. But I kept circling back and taking another look at that image, and it began to make sense to me, because I had a father about that age, and what looked like anger I could detect was actually fear. Albrecht Dürer managed to capture a durational aspect of life, a man who's about 70 years old, who seems to be losing his paternal authority, and he's pissed off about it. And so the fear that came through what looked like anger is something that one could add to the durational dimension of the thing as a result of what I would call the phenomenology of reception. How is it that we're situated such that a particular image can mean something to us? And so one of the questions to constantly ask yourself when you're doing an analysis of images is, what am I up to? Who am I supposedly talking to about these images? What kind of coherence or perhaps counter-coherence am I trying to construct by looking at images? To what extent can a particular image exist within all the other images, or to what extent does it resist those images? The concept of counter-coherence, which I've been working with for quite a few years, I derive from a terrific book by Mika Ball, a image theorist who's written 3 books from a feminist perspective on the Hebrew Bible. And in one of them, Death and Dissymmetry, she derives from the stories what she calls a counter-coherence, because the Hebrew Bible for the ordinary reader is a heroic story about how one man named Abraham becomes a nation. Through the work of some heroic men, the judges who win battles. It turns out, however, that many young women are murdered in the households of judges. And so what she does is recover those stories, and it becomes a different kind of story. So the problem of coherence, counter-coherence, in other words, how does the photograph fit in to the trajectory of war photographer? What are you up to? What kind of question are you asking? How can you reflect on your own reception? What are the uncertainties of that? One of the concepts that helped me with that, Rosalind Krauss came up with years ago. She asked a question about the discursive spaces of the photograph. And she looks at 2 particular images of the same thing, one of which is blurry and the boundaries are unclear. It's an aesthetic one. And one of them is done by a surveyor, in which the boundaries are very clear. And so when a picture is being taken for scientific purposes as opposed to aesthetic purposes, the discursive spaces within which it's taken affect how it's going to be understood. I'll stop babbling now. Yeah, Sam.
Thanks, Julia, for your question. And just to add another dimension to it, and this is again drawing on Mike's work. This was Mike's reading of Gillo Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers and the exhibition Slow Look, the exhibition of Beautiful Suffering. And the concept that was derived was that of slow looking, that which gives or rather lends the image to available for extended reflection. But there's another element to it, which is when you think of war photography, it tends towards the spectacular, the broken bones, the blood, the tears. But there's something else that one must also attend to, which is what becomes available for reflection when the images are not being captured, yet the violence persists. So in addition to slow looking, being attentive to what Rob Nixon called slow violence, a violence that is attritional, is not spectacular, often takes place out of sight, and extends beyond the moment when our attention is being drawn to Vietnam, for instance. What are the effects of Agent Orange today? When when people are saying the war is already over, how, for instance, do we receive different images differently? When one thinks of the 9/11 attacks, for instance, there is that particular event, but as one sees with the advocacy of Jon Stewart, who is doing a lot of work to illustrate that the first responders, the firefighters, the paramedics, and the policemen who went in are so many years, 20 years later, suffering from cancer out of the impact and what people inhaled. And we are aware of that when it comes to 9/11, but such questions are not asked when one thinks about Gaza. Such questions are not asked when one thinks of Aleppo. Such questions are not asked when you're thinking of what's happening in Tigray and other places. So even when we receive images, a lot of it has to do with what Mike has just said. What is the phenomenology of reception of the image, and what ethics always overcodes even how we receive the same image and violence against bodies? What gives it duration, and which is only captured in an instance, and then we turn away and look at something else?
Let me take another avenue into this. I was thinking about war. E.L. Doctorow's last novel that I recall was called The March. It's about Sherman's march during the Civil War. If you ask the question, what is the Civil War about, and you read Doctorow, you don't get anything about battles to speak of. The main focus, his main protagonist, is a German doctor who works in a medical area, dealing with the wounded. What is the Civil War about? The way in which the bodies that have been damaged show up, and the way in which this doctor has to negotiate his way through the problem of the wounded. And so it's never clear what the Civil War is about. It depends on the angle of vision, the protagonists, what particular piece you look at. And the same as with photography. One of the questions always is, why this image rather than some other image? Why this and not that? What kind of story is enabled by those particular kind of images? What kind of story is enabled by that kind of protagonist as opposed to another? One of Russell Banks' best novels is about the life of John Brown, but it's told from the point of view of one of John Brown's sons who's trying to make sense of things. And he always asks the wrong questions of some of the slaves and former slaves, and suddenly finds all kinds of revelations. It's the man on the periphery of John Brown, but you get a different angle of vision of what it's about, what his campaign was like, what the world space was like at the time. There are a lot of different choices. And to construct those choices, you have to decide on what kind of story you want to tell and what kinds of juxtapositions you want to create in order to unsettle the usual way that people think about something.
Mike, can I just jump and make a commentary that sure. Maybe you can react also, but in terms of Julia's question and yours and Sam's response, because while you and Sam were responding, I also thought about your own engagement with the different kind of picture that one has depending on one is and how one positions itself, him or herself, in relation, for example, to the atomic bomb, right? I remember if I'm not mistaken, in your Hiroshima Temporalities and in War, Atrocity and Justice, yeah. Depending on where you look, you can picture a mushroom, right? Or a jellyfish with all the different perspectives. So
Yeah,
I was wondering about these different perspectives and different temporalities involved, depending on the position you're framing and picturing. And
yeah, we understand nuclearism through the symbol of the mushroom cloud. Yeah, in Masuji Obuse's novel about it, his main character, who's based on Ibuse's actual experience, sees it as a jellyfish. And suddenly, what a revelation. This is a man who's seeing it in real time as it moves. It's not a still, it's a durational image. And when it's durational, it becomes a jellyfish as opposed to a mushroom. And that seems like a trivial difference. Mushroom, jellyfish, jellyfish, mushroom. No, it tells you about the locus of enunciation of the observer.
Rob.
Roberto?
Can I jump in and react to Mike? Mike, I just wanted to react to your introduction on the new project on the aesthetic of equality. So here, and before doing that, let me just share some of the traces that I was going to share before, but like to later now. So in 2014, Mike was here in EDI and gave a series of lectures. A few of them you may find it available in the YouTube. But in this same context, one of our students who had concluded a beautiful monograph in the end of her undergraduate course, Isabella Carpena, who wrote Tropicalia, which I recommend. So Tropicalia is one of the traces left by Mike here. She actually with us did an interview and then a beautiful, beautiful film. If I may share with you, it's also available in YouTube. I highly recommend. It's called Shapiro from Isabella Carpena. And in that film, Mike, there's a passage, if I remember correctly, when you're talking about the indigenous subject and how by saying anything, the indigenous subject is enacting a political act because in many ways he or she is displacing the order of things. And with that, I thought about your commentaries in the introduction, and I was wondering about this interest of yours that I can find in different places, and it resonated with your introduction today in these interruptions in relation to a certain politics of aesthetics. And in doing so, precisely as you share with us today, create an opening of other alternative possible worlds. So and here I remember also your engagement with Rancière's The Night of the Proletariat, how in many ways you are juxtaposing, intervening in your juxtapositions and thinking with art, literature, films, and in doing so, create openings that in many ways denounce the effects of a certain colonial, violent organization of things, right, that are connected to the invisibility of those that with and through your engagements, you open space to make them visible or something like that. So I wanted to react by bringing your reading of poetics, the politics of aesthetics here, right? And in doing so, because I understand that this, on the one hand, relates to your engagement with philopoiesis, but also with montage and juxtaposition. And here's a second point. earlier today, Rob was mentioning about his own reading of IPS. And he was referring to the interest that he has, particularly in the commas in between the international, political, sociology, and comma, 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 right? In many ways, I read this, I read Rob's commas, right? Close to your engagement with punctuations. So there's something about the juxtapositions, the encounters that you provoke, the punctuations that you engage with, right? That in many ways it speaks to a critical intervention in terms of the politics of aesthetics. I wonder if you could react to that.
Well, yeah, to react to your last point, I simply say that what punctuation was about for me was the way in which reordering the structure of a text, whether it's musical or visual or what have you, forces us to think. Usually we simply recognize things. And when you're not involved in ordinary recognition, you have to think. But I really want to go back to what you were saying at the beginning, because what that resurrects for me is one of my primary concerns, and that is the worthiness of all lives. Yesterday, I mentioned a novel by Daniel Alarcon called At Night We Walk in Circles. There's a short version from the center of it, an essay he wrote, a story he wrote called Collectors. It's about this prison in Peru, which was destroyed by the army and everyone died. But anyway, at the center of that story is a relationship between a playwright, Henry, who gets incarcerated because he's written a play called The Idiot President, and a man named Rogelio, who's been sent to prison because he's been running drugs in a truck for his brother. One of the things that's interesting is here you have a playwright who's very literate, and then you have Rogelio, who's, as pointed out, dropped out of school and is illiterate. He literally can't read. And ordinarily, meritocratic structures tend to belittle people who are illiterate. What happens is that when Henry gets into the prison, he's scared shitless and he doesn't know how he's going to cope, and doesn't even get out of bed for 2 days. Rogelio finally says to him, "It's okay for you to move." At which point they start a conversation, and Rogelio begins to tell him how to survive in the prison yard, how to read it. He says, when you're standing there, take a close look. When people smile, can you see their teeth? When they're standing there, do they have their hands at their side or is it folded in front of them? And he goes into this long disquisition about how to read the prison yard. They're both readers in different ways, as it turns out. And what the story does is to intervene in the ordinary notions about who merits special attention because of their ability to read, to think, etc. It turns out they have a love affair. And after after Henry gets out, the National Guard comes in and kills everybody. And so his former lover is dead. Can't hear you, Rob. Microphone.
Trouble with my microphone.
Yes.
Yes.
Can I ask for Diana?
Hi. I'd like to first thank everyone in IPS and PUC for this wonderful event. And as Mike said, I had the honor of being in his last class before his retirement at Hawaii. And it was definitely one of the best experiences of my academic life. So many thanks, Mike. It was amazing. And as Professor Opondo and Professor Yamato said, Mike is always inspiring us to think with events and encounters. And I was wondering about this ethics of encounter that all of the panelists said, and I was wondering about its relationship with the politics of exclusion. So specifically about the encounters that were designed not to happen, and about the violences that encounters that don't happen generate. For Mike specifically, I was thinking about how the swimming pool at LA, how this private swimming pool prevents some encounters from happening, and how this aesthetics, this architecture is designed to lead to this encounter that don't happen. And for Professor Yamato, in yesterday's panel, you mentioned in one of your comments about the pluriverse and about Marisol de la Cadena work. And I was wondering about how the ethics of encounter work in the case of the pluriverse, and how these different words, how when we do not recognize the existence of these many words, how this can lead to certain violences or for certain encounters not to happen. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, for this wonderful panel and this wonderful event.
Let me run out briefly a scenario that I've used before. It's in my teaching in Rio, among other things. One of the things I learned from Martin Heidegger is the importance of the word how. It's not what you are, who you are, but how you're situated such that things mean what they mean to you. And so I go through this imagination. You're driving to work and you're in a hurry. And an elderly person has decided to go out for a slow drive. And so they're in your way. Now, what that person is for you, how that person exists for you, is it merely as an impediment. Right? There's nothing else about their life that's important at that moment. And so how an other is for you is a function of the projects you're involved in, both more generally in the long term and in the immediate moment. And so if you're unable to slow yourself down and say to yourself, that's an interesting life, it's probably very complicated. There's a lot that I could learn, not only about that person, but about myself in the process of paying attention to that person. And so what is violence about? Violence is about the agendas that divide us so constantly that there's no ability for one to learn from another. And so I take a lot from the suggestion of Levinas, who says about the other, allow that other to afflict you, to have an impact on you, which means that you have to be open to it and not presume what that other is necessarily about. That other is not another you in the same ordinary way. We knowers, as Nietzsche says, know very little about ourselves. What are the tactics by which we can open ourselves to the other so that we can learn who and what we are, and therefore become more hospitable? Because as I've argued in terms of ethics, which Roberto has brought up a couple of times, to be welcoming to the other, you have to be welcoming to that otherness within yourself, which is very difficult to discover.
Can I jump in? Oh, please, Sam, please do.
Thanks, Adriana. I'm going to perform just a few rereadings and in response to the question of the ethics of encounter. Think of, let's say, the colonial encounter, the familiar narrative of Christopher Columbus, seeking a sea route to India, getting to there, and the conquest of the Americas, Hispaniola, among other things, and the atrocity that follows that, the genocide, among other things. These narratives, historically, for instance, privileges one kind of encounter. It makes us read Christopher Columbus through the ship logs as a text that gives us a way of thinking about that text. However, when one reads his other text, his prophecies, rather than his navigational notes, you find a very different motivation. Yeah, for instance, it's not only seeking a sea route to India that Columbus seeks in order to be able to gain, the wealth that India has. So already we start a different cartography of where wealth lies in the world. It's not the Iberian Peninsula, it's India. But the motivations, among other things, was because Christopher Columbus was a reader of St. Augustine. Yeah, and he believes the world is ending in 7,000 years, and you have only 150 years. And part of the bullion is supposed to be used to reconquer the Holy Lands from the Muslims. So in the conquest of the Americas, for instance, there's already an inherent Islamophobia. Oftentimes we read that narrative starting with a very presentist orientation towards it. In the quest to move, we'd say horizontally across the globe, people like Columbus weren't only trying to get to other lands geographically, he was also trying to hasten the coming of the end of the world. There's an eschatology that animates it. So here you're seeing how what one's reading of colonial encounters also has to be read by taking very seriously the cosmologies that produce it. There has to be a cosmological clash, if you like, not civilizational clash, as we are often made to think about what is at stake here. So we see how it's a cosmological question that is actually at play, and that arrives when asking what exactly happens in this encounter. It's not just an encounter of cultures, it's an encounter of worlds and world making and world unmaking practices that is at stake, emerging from which position one decides to even read the narrative of one familiar figure.
Yeah. As you're talking, Sam, I'm reminded of Aimé Césaire's great line about all those colonial peoples that were crushed. They never thought of themselves as the idea, they were the fact. And the question then becomes, how do we recover some of that facticity? And one of the things that I discovered as I was doing some analysis of the history of American jazz while doing a reading of Toni Morrison's novel by that name was that European colonialism was tonal as well as physical. It effaced a lot of African music, and the place where it can be recovered is in Afro-American jazz.
Can I jump in and react to Adriana's, Rob?
Sure.
Very quickly, Adriana, thank you so much. And I think, your points, my commentaries, they are in many different ways, much inspired and influenced by Mike's work, right? So when I refer to today, this ethical political, I was precisely mentioning this Levinasian, Derridian ethical political position of hospitality that I understand permeates many of Mike's work. For instance, moral spaces, violent cartographies, and so on. And but going to your point, here I'm thinking in two correlated authors. One, I think in Derrida's critique to Levi-Strauss, to a critique of a certain ethnocentric critique of ethnocentrism. It's in the middle of grammatology. And I read it, or I'm now trying to read it in close relation to the kind of violence that I understand Gayatri Spivak is denouncing in posing the question, can the subaltern speak? There's something in that problematization that I understand has all to do with the kind of politics of worlds and politics of cosmologies that I understood Sam was pointing to, right? And more recently, I tend to correlate that with a broader conception of the politics of languages and translation, right? Because in many ways, the language, concepts, assumptions is part of the worlds within which we are part, the cosmologies within which we are part, right? So in engaging with the pluriverse, Marisol de la Cadenas, I understand that what she and others are calling for is the kind of taking into account what precisely Mike has been done for many decades and just responded to us in terms of focusing on the worldling of all lives or something like that. I cannot really recall exactly the terms that he used, right? Mike, one of the concerns that I have is how can you do that without problematizing the cosmology, the world, and with that, the language, categories, assumptions that you carry within you. And that's why I fully agree and actually follow Mike when he says that, of course, the relation with the other has to have a problematization of oneself, right?
Let me just take this opportunity to say hello, Victor. Good to see you.
Any other questions?
Danielle, I think Danielle.
Danielle.
Can't hear. Microphone.
All right, Hoffert, thank you.
Good to see you.
Hello, Mike. Long time we haven't met.
Yes,
long period of time, yeah. I'd like to, I couldn't be in that meeting. I entered a little bit late and not speak. As Roberto mentioned before, we were students of Mike during the PhD. We took a class in cinematic geopolitics, and I am always glad that I took that course and that I learned a lot with Mike in that course, and I have been sharing that with my students now since we started here the PhD and the graduate program, no, first semester and then the PhD. Everything that I have learned. Before thanking Mike, I want to thank João Nogueira because we are here, and I think that those studies, I learned about the studies of Michael Shapiro before in the Theory of International Relations course during my PhD, and then had the opportunity of meeting Mike and being his student. So I think it's that this environment that we have here, and being with Mike, Rob, Sam, Jeff, and other professors, it was made possible, you know, by João's action, let me say, like direct like that, in the international relations field here in Brazil, particularly in PUC-Rio. And Mike, I would like to thank you also because your history with us is a history of also an extensive availability and an open heart. And when we get to know you closer, we know how much we can learn from you about your knowledge. No, I have several of your books here and texts, but also from talking to you and being able to share with you, about the experience. And part of your books have to do with the experience of life, of living, and of living between the real life and the representations of life, the text produced about our life and the humanity in the world. So I'd like to thank you and then try to engage asking you, I'm curious, how have you been seeing, I mean, you or some of your students, graduate or undergraduate students that you have contact in Hawaii or in other places, how have you been seeing the texts and the representations produced about our times now, the COVID-19 times, all this, the vaccines, the empty streets, how have you, I mean, the texts are being produced like by the media, etc. But also in the future, we're going to have like books and photographs and movies that are going to be referring to that time. And maybe they're going to be based on the representation that the media is bringing to us. How do you see the representation of what has been happening in the world in these COVID times? I know I'm asking you that because I know that you are still very, very active and engaged, and I know that maybe soon we're going to read more and more about that. So how do you see the world today in these COVID times and the perspective of texts that are being writing, relating maybe also to some other texts? Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Good to see you again. Yeah. Let me just say something about my experience teaching in Brazil. I've never had such a receptive audience as I've had while teaching at PUC. And when I describe what it's like to people, what I say is something like this: no matter how complicated what you say might be at a particular point, the Brazilian students, rather than being irritated about you being difficult to understand, are intrigued by it. I just love the extent to which everyone around here is willing to be open to things which are difficult to kind of grasp, as it were. And so I felt this tremendous sense of welcome, no matter what it is that I wanted to think about. In terms of what you're asking, Daniel, I don't know what to say about that, except that I feel blessed that I can continue to work. I'm still compos mentis enough. Every day I'm stimulated by something I see or I read, and it helps me produce more work. Like this very morning, I was reading the New York Times about a woman who's got all sorts of interesting tattoos. And what she does is she copies the tattoos from some corpses of Inuits from 500 years ago. And in a sense, what she is walking public history that had been buried for hundreds of years until those corpses came up. And now the importance of how those people represented themselves is now being represented in public space. And so she's basically an instrument of a new public history that was absent from the way in which those people were represented. That excited the hell out of me thinking about that. And I begin to try to articulate that with the other things that I'm working on and thinking about. There's another important ingredient about that, which I mentioned earlier, and that is my morning coffee. Once you have a shot of caffeine, things can be much more stimulating than they were otherwise. The only drug I still use.
Sam, Berto, any final comments?
Maybe Mike, there was the other question that Daniel asked about the pandemic, writings on the pandemic, of which you've been doing some, so you'll elaborate.
Yeah, Sam and I have a long chapter in our book on the aesthetics of precarity on the pandemic, read through a variety of cultural texts, because what the pandemic is about depends on what particular textuality you begin to look at. And then, as Sam was mentioning earlier, how you compose. What the pandemic becomes for us is how we juxtapose things, ultimately.
So with the awareness, and that part of the aesthetic is that of separation, whether it's with the media representations, going back to reproduce familiar tropes, as Adriana, the question you're asking, in the American context, it was using Vietnam, more than Vietnam, familiar tropes, again, talking about Chernobyl, for instance, to be able to make sense of this. Is COVID-19 China's Chernobyl? Is some of the questions that were being posed. And at the same time, the kind of early celebration in the US context of the essential worker, who for the most part is most precarious labor. The people who are cleaning their hospitals, ancillary staff, people for whom capital has abandoned, who are presented as essential, and in their very disposability, that kind of economy comes into play. So actually there are two pieces, Mike, when you think about it. We've written one piece, which appears in the book, actually both of them. One is titled Ruminations on the Apocalyptic Sublime. And it's a reflection of the convergence of sublimes, the nuclear sublime, the pandemic sublime, and the racial sublime. You have to be able to think about George Floyd, for instance, who survives COVID-19 but doesn't survive the breathlessness induced by the murderous police in the US. And the other piece was reading Francois Vager's work and then going back and reading a text that Beto referenced, Dirty Pretty Things, for instance, and reading it in the context of the pandemic, where some of the architectural forms that you are seeing was the conversion of hotel space into medical space. A hotel as a contact zone, a zone of hospitality and hostility and precarity was being converted into medical space. But when you read Dirty Pretty Things, a film like that, it always revealed how hotel space was a medicalized space for some. How those who can afford, for instance, with medical tourism, you can go to Apollo in India if you have cancer, you can go to Costa Rica. So hotel space and hospital space, again, etymologically linked, with Derrida, hospitality. You are able to see all this playing out, and the pandemic just explodes these phenomena that are always already present, and it becomes an accelerator, an amplifier. We have to start asking what migration regimes will be right now with all the vaccine nationalism. You live in Brazil. What does the pandemic, how does it reconfigure our world? This thing, pandemos, that should be all humanity, as precarious, again, becomes an intensification of partitions that are already there. So to think with that.
In the first draft that Sam was mostly responsible for, he spent a lot of time on the concept of breathlessness. And as soon as you think about breathing, there's so many other kinds of constructions and problems that begin to come up. I thought immediately, for example, of that great moment in the famous play, My Fair Lady. I've grown accustomed to her face. It's like breathing out and breathing in. And I thought, breathing out and breathing in, it's not the same for everybody. In a whole variety of places where air has become a precious commodity.
Any final thoughts from anyone? Mike?
I just want to say thank you, everybody, for being part of this. It really felt very nice to be able to see all of you again.
As you know, I've known you in many contexts for many years, and I have an overwhelming sense of your generosity. Generosity of person, generosity of spirit, generosity of intellect. And I think you've seen that here today.
Thanks, Rob. Rob and I met when I gave the Griffith Lecture at American University many years ago, and everything was going fine in the conversation until old Mr. Griffith, who was really past it, stood up and said, "All this is very interesting, but we know what the real problems are: too much money and too much sex." It was a stunning moment.
Downhill ever since. Okay, I guess I should call this to a close and hope to see many of you tomorrow and indeed Friday.
Thanks, everybody.
So,
thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Berto. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
So many people on the screen I'd like to talk to and hug and whatever.
Thank you.